Thank you for joining us on this episode of MSP 1337, a podcast dedicated to helping MSPs and their clients navigate cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a journey, but it doesn't mean you have to travel alone. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Pinpoint Solutions, a consulting firm dedicated to providing cybersecurity leadership and guidance to MSPs and their clients. Think of us as your virtual CISO or security advisor. Head on over to pinpointsolutions.com to find out more. Now on with the show. Welcome to this week's episode of MSP 1337. I'm joined this week by Stel Valavanis. Welcome, Stel.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Hey, Stel, I left this out, but you're with onShore Security and you are an MSSP. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. For our listeners, I think it's important to note that we bring vendors, managed service providers, and maybe in some cases we'll even bring on some actual clients to participate in the weekly episodes. But for today, we want to talk about why the SMB space has been totally alienated from the rest of sort of the industry when we start talking about cybersecurity. You brought it up. I think it's a very valid point. Open source tools is something that you and I both like to get excited about. You know, what can we do that's free? How powerful is it? How much work's involved in configuring it? And probably one of the best examples that we could use is to think about something like an Alien Vault product. They've got a community open source version, but then the paid version is like you're starting out in that $50,000 range. Obviously not going to be done right away by any of the SMBs that are out there. Talk to me from your perspective of what your thoughts are around the SMB space and why the tools really haven't evolved in such a way that says, hey, this is meant for an 8-person company. This is meant for the 25 or 75 and under businesses so that they can improve a security posture without breaking the bank.
Well, first of all, my migration away from the SMB space and away from the MSP business, going back 7 years now, when we first made that decision, was very much the same story as wanting to do things more securely and, let's say, richer at the higher end.
Sure,
there literally is no cost model that works for the SMB space with today's stack, let's say, any of the, many different ways you can shape that stack. And your example is a good one, the Alien Vault one. Sorry.
So that just sounds really doom and gloom, right, for the SMB. And I say that because I know that that's not really the case. It's just that when we think SMB and we think about the industry as a whole, the burden from a cost standpoint to an SMB, as we start layering security tools on, you start to have to go, okay, if I'm going to add $3 here and $7 there and $15 here, at some point, what was kind of an accepted roughly $150 per user per month model starts to become $200 and $225 and $250. And most of those businesses that you're going to put that cost on, that's a burden that they can't take on. And the arguments are going to be, because this is happening, there are commercial and open source tools being leveraged by the MSP community that says, hey, don't worry, your costs are going to go up, but not exponentially, because we've got a relationship with X vendor, X partner that now caters to the SMB space. And I think it's important to point out a couple of things. So I think you can help me out with this. Mm-hmm. Where are we compromising when we do that? Because I think it's like, and maybe this isn't in a bad way, but to recognize that maybe we're not as secure as we could be. And maybe there's like a sweet spot that says, Chris, if you were to take a 8-person or 50-person company and you were to start layering some security on there and not break the bank, what would those tools or services look like?
Well, that's what we have to find. And I don't have a good answer. And I could tell you the reason why I don't have a good answer is not because there aren't less expensive tools. It's not necessarily the case that they're less inferior because they're less expensive or free because they're open source. We use open source wherever we could. I mean, open source doesn't necessarily mean free, by the way. Open source means we have access to the source, but it often does. And so they're somewhat synonymous. But I don't think that magic, or at least closer to magic stack or whatnot, is really been found. So I could tell you the various ways that you quickly get efficient if you can't spend tons of money. And by the way, let's not exclude the big elephant in the room. You can go use OSIM, the open source Alien Vault, whatever package, which we've never used, but you can use it. And does that magically make you security engineers and analysts to be at the helm of that? Does that magically make you have daily tuning and review? I mean, these are the things that are an absolute must on the enterprise, and the SMB is just not going to cover. So even if we right away, let's going to create that class right away. Let's create the class of, you're not going to have the ongoing human audit analysis going on, period. It's just not cost effective in the SMB space. And so now let's try to find some kind of automated stack that gives you a lot of that security. What are all the things that we're talking about? We're talking about collecting data. That's, I'd say, the number one thing that the SMB space is ignoring, is getting that data into one place.
Well, that's CIS top 20, right? CIS top 20 control 3 is very specific about, if the only thing you did was turn on log collection, turn on the log, let the logs collect, that satisfies a control for a group one. And that's no small feat.
Even if you're negligent and not even looking at it, having it is huge.
Which is crazy.
Ask your buddy who has that big breach and with the ransomware, and they're going to make a decision about whether they're rebuilding systems, or they're getting insurance involved, or if they can restore from backup. I mean, so let me throw in another kind of low hanging fruit one. I shouldn't call the log collection, and by the way, log collection is not as easy as you think. It's just setting up a tool, because so many SMB systems don't really have any kind of good way to push logs to a centralized place. They weren't built with that in mind. So that often forces you to enterprise tools, but that's getting better, which is nice.
Yeah, agreed. Like, you've got products like Alert Logic and a couple others that aren't necessarily, breaking the bank as far as being able to, collect data into a centralized location.
Right.
I think our bigger challenges go back to what you said just a minute ago. It's like, when you go down this path, who on your team is going to handle the management of that information? Because I feel like we're getting into that double-edged sword space, right? Where if I have the means to look at the data, what are my obligations when something happens because I wasn't looking at the data for devices that I've claimed responsibility for?
Oh yeah, I mean, you are adding, let's call it, liability. But I think you can't avoid it, and this is why I'll get there's a whole other rabbit hole to go down with policy and regulations and whatnot. But I would think we need to improve that there.
Sure.
Thank you for bringing up CIS 20 though, because CIS 20 is the only real framework that is kind of doable, let's say, or practical for the SMB space. NIST and COBIT and CMMC, whatever, are immediately daunting. Definitely PCI DSS actually is useful too, I'd say. So there's something to work from there, but other than people who are using have to do PCI DSS for credit card processing, there really isn't any kind of regulatory pressure. The insurance companies aren't putting pressure.
Well, they're starting to, with the questionnaires are sending out. So I'd like to, I want to come back to this here in a second, but we started talking about CIS and PCI. You and I have had these conversations many times. In fact, back when I was, full-time with onShore, one of my responsibilities was going through things like the Baldrige report and some of the other tools that help with, financial, and, these frameworks were written for the 5,000 employee organization, right? They were written for enterprise. Unfortunately, at the government level and state level, local government level, we're seeing our SMBs being told, like, you have to meet these requirements too. You have to do what's called out in this, 170 plus controls, which in many cases is totally unrealistic. As I go through CIS as an example with a lot of these smaller MSPs, we look at, control one with asset management. And, one of the controls in there is like, talking about having digital certificates with all your devices in 802.1x with how you manage those devices and port level control on the switches. And those two controls specifically, I don't know that those are relevant like they were 5+ years ago, because we have other ways now of protecting the assets that are not tied to that level of physical control. And so that's just one example that's more of like in the SMB space is not relevant because we've evolved. Another example is like you look at NIST and talking about like why passwords no longer have the same need to be controlled in the same way. And I know they haven't finalized that as far as making it official, but through things like 2FA, multi-factor authentication, we overcome some of those limitations. And so I think, and I'm asking you this question because we've seen it at the top. You and I have worked with the largest of enterprises, but at the same time, you and I have also worked with enterprises that have 8 and 10 employees, and we're being put in a position of saying satisfy these same things. Pepita, that's another one. Like, if you're a company of 6, how do you go about satisfying something that's full of ambiguity and lack of direction, right? So back to the SMB space with that, where do you think an SMB should consider spending money? Because I think tying me to a framework or locking me in to satisfying a set of controls gets really dangerous when I have 8 employees and 50% or more of those controls may not apply to me or are unrealistic for me to try and achieve financially.
I wish there were good answers, but what we could do is gain a lot of clarity. And if we got more mature there, and I'm really referring to writing policies, if we got more mature there, I think each organization can find a better place for themselves. I think we could do actually some decent job at something that's common a lot between them, and I could make give some examples, but I'll put it onto the MSP. The MSP, whether you want to add that little S in there for yourself or not, I would almost insist that you do, but it's up to you.
Right.
Look, you don't have to become the engineer to be able to be like a vCISO and give people some kind of direction on not just the frameworks, but developing the policy that satisfies those. So if you, for instance, ignore a control in some framework that you want to follow, whatever, it could be a simple one like CS20, have that documented. Be very clear that okay, we're not analyzing our logs, but we're collecting them. Here's the decision we made. We understand the risk. Here's the process in place. Password management. Here's we understand what the Cadillac is of that, but here is what we're doing and why. I mean, with your eyes open. If you do that, and frankly, it's tedious. It takes a lot of kind of thought work and time and back and forth. But if you think about the dollars spent for it, it's fairly mild. I mean, I would say it's the biggest bang for your buck. Sit down and map that out. Then you're going to make decisions about your stack. Instead, people are just buying stuff. And they're buying stuff without even thinking about what. Yeah, I mean, I know that's one of your pet peeves.
Well,
it's buying stuff.
Well, it's my pet peeve because I'm now on the recovery plan from shiny object syndrome, where if it was like good price, looked pretty enough, and seemed to address something that I didn't know I had a gap for, I bought it, and it might have been 2 years before I implemented it, if I ever implemented it. I think what you're getting into is, it's not so much that MSPs want to buy tools by just buying tools. It's that we look at the overwhelming task of what would be to write a policy, and it doesn't have to be overwhelming, because I think you just articulated it well. If I think about, say, passwords, or I think about, say, a minimum baseline configuration for the laptop or desktop that's being deployed, I have the evidence to map to a policy that doesn't exist in my company yet. And MSPs are great at saying, we have policies for that. It's up here in my head, right? And I have to, in some cases, go based on the evidence. I believe you do have that policy, but you just hired Johnny or Chris. And does Johnny or Chris also have the policy that's in your head verbatim in his head? Because that's where we tend to become unsecure, right? That tends to be when the default password is my go-to password.
And a way to audit that if it's possible. And if there isn't a way to audit that, that should be part of the documentation. This isn't a control that's not audited.
So do you think in the SMB space, it's okay to have like templated policies that are shared where you look at what are the areas in this policy that we could really doctor for you to make you the snowflake have the relevancy of what's in this policy specific to you? Or should we really look at how do policies get written more um, I don't want to say from scratch. I think scratch is a little bit overkill.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
but that the content of a policy really needs to be specific to that business across the whole policy.
I hate to say it, but I've never ever found a single client where, even though we're starting from templates, we are always starting from non-zero. Absolutely. Right. So in that sense, yes, we're sharing. That's there. But I have never ever seen a situation where there isn't some adjustment to almost every policy and procedure. It's just it's even in the same industry. Remember, my clients are banks mainly. Those are our biggest, except for really one other pretty big enterprise client. But the banks are our biggest and our core clients. And even between them, it's just amazing how much difference there is. And I whether that's good or bad, I mean, I can make arguments, but it is the case. Well, so yeah, I assume you're going to be doing that.
So I want to come back to the enterprise and tools here in a second, but the last thing I wanted to say on the policy side is what you were talking about made me start thinking about less policy and more plan. So I think about the written information security plan that's pretty common in at least 3 or 4 frameworks. I think you could write a policy or a plan that is a lot less 4 and 6 page documents for things like asset management and more like a 10 to 15 page, written information security plan where you are looking at my overall security posture, right? So like, instead of getting into like, this control is addressed this way and going into 6 and 7 pages of detail, you could go, this control is addressed and have a relatively high level answer regardless of what your documentation and procedures look like, because it's an SMB, right? I was dealing with a client the other day who literally has no core infrastructure, and they have to go through NIST 171 for DoD contract, and they literally don't have any infrastructure. It's like the end user has a device, stuff is stored in a specific cloud account, and that's it. So the problem is the MSP that's helping this client's like, I got to answer all these questions. And I'm like, yeah. And answering the question is not applicable or irrelevant is not an answer. There has to be a full explanation that says the nature of our business. It looks like this. We store our data here. This is how that's secured. That answer might be very redundant, but you got to fill out each of those answers with that redundant answer and can't just say, see answer 2.
Right. And there's a trap there. Be careful, because just because your workloads are, not right there in your hand, I'm paying whatever hosting provider for this SaaS or Salesforce, whatever, I don't know, whatever.
Yeah.
Doesn't magically mean you have no liability. This was the wake up call we gave to our school clients last year. We brought in a law firm that specializes in privacy. They're, very big, in the, some of the litigation that's gone on with SOPA, which is the Student Online Privacy Protection Act. One big wake up call to them is, I don't care if you use PowerSchool or whatever, data getting out in the wild is your responsibility. You can't really outsource the risk. You can outsource the function, but you still own that. So NA may very well be a trap for you when you think I've outsourced that and I don't. So
that's a good one. Can't outsource the risk. That's a really good way to explain to a client why they need to do something, because even though I might be helping them address or remediate,
right,
I'm not absorbing their risk. Which leads me to, along those same lines, especially when you start talking about like CMMC and some of the NIST stuff, it's the supply chain, right? Not necessarily. I could be doing a really good job from a security maturity standpoint, addressing the controls and showing real compliance against a framework, mapping my environment to the checklist. But what if my vendor who supplies me with whatever it is isn't. We can go back to the Target breach, right? The HVAC guys. Target had a great security program going, and there was a lot of evidence to support that. But obviously, the HVAC company did not have a good security program going.
So we are go back before even SOC 2, we were SAS 70 certified, and the reason why we had to be, now it's SOC 2, and Type 2 means that you're audited too, is because our bank clients don't just say check the checkbox; they literally have to walk through our controls. We have to publish our controls under NDA, of course, so they can see, okay, what happens to our data? Who has access to it? What happens to it after, you're archiving it? How's it deleted? How is it tagged? How's it encrypted? I mean, all these things matter, and they need to know what happens with that provider. And by the way, they do that with all the providers, not just with us. So you have to integrate your controls across networks, not just say, here's that stamp.
So a question then on sort of frameworks and thinking about the SMB space and thinking about like CIS and the way it's framed, because it does create, I think, especially when you look at the groups and the models, it says if you can at least do this, great. If you can do more, puts you into group 2, again, you're still moving up. Do you think that as an SMB who might have to do, let's say they're being tasked with, in order to be working with us, you've got to prove CMMC or NIST 171. Well, that's really hard for someone who's got 5-6 employees to go through and satisfy all those controls. And quite honestly, is unrealistic to even say that in many cases even matters, because so much of what's in there, they don't have.
Yeah.
Do you think it's realistic to say, like you were just saying about SOC, the bank isn't asking you to be like the bank. The bank is asking you on the controls that matter, how do you show evidence to support that you're meeting that criteria, regardless of what framework you might use to show the security and compliance for your organization? Like, can I get away with using a different framework for someone who comes to me and says, hey, to work with us, you got to be CMMC. And you're like, well, we're CIS level 2. Here's the evidence.
Yeah, you're not going to get away with that. I hate to say it. If they're going to ask for a specific framework, even if they would agree with your argument, that's a fight they don't want to fight with whoever they have to answer to. So just assume that's the case. But that said, and we're specifically have to be SOC 2 Type 2 for not all our clients, but many of our clients. And we might even run into some point we might have to do ISO. Right. Because, there's some
that gets into that global supply chain, right?
Yeah. And it hasn't happened yet, but there was a client at one point that was a maybe, and we're happy. Well, I mean, mapping from one to the other isn't undoable. It's just yet another project we'd rather take. But to be clear, they're not just doing this for the checkbox, and they're not just doing it to make sure they address the things that matter. They literally want to see that you have all your controls mapped out, whether even with the ones that maybe don't matter so much to them, or, in other words, having a rule in place and saying this is allowed, this is not allowed, and here's how I audit that, it is more valuable, even if it's subpar in some way or not the way somebody else would do it. That's more valuable to have that documented than to not document it and do something awesome. So it's
the documented answer that matters. That's a huge thing. So for the SMB, like you said, it's not necessarily the lift or the cost to put products and services in. It's the time spent to answer the controls, even if the answer is, I don't know, because it shows the person that you give that back to that you've taken the time to walk through and look at what are they asking of you.
Oh yeah. Whether I'm the end customer or I'm the vendor in the middle, I'm far more worried about somebody not having thought through stuff and not knowing what they're doing, or they have it.
They don't know what you're talking about,
crappy.
Right? Yeah, right. They're like, what's NIST? Yeah, that's on this list over here, and you're not on the list. Okay. So I think we've exhausted a little bit the frameworks, the checklists, and just kind of articulating the SMB that this isn't an overwhelming, unrealistic opportunity for an SMB to satisfy a framework in the sense that they're answering the controls, which is a big part of it.
And Chris, let me interrupt you, because it's the act of doing that it's way cheaper than buying more products.
Right.
And they're going to get value out of it themselves.
Right.
Like
Right.
they will learn a lot about themselves and make different decisions if they walk through even the simplest of, frameworks and process of documenting.
I love that. There is hope for the SMB. We started out with doom and gloom, and we're going to wrap up with some hope. So I wanted to go back to the tools for a minute as we get ready to close this out. And the reason why I wanted to go back to the tools for a minute is you mentioned enterprise and enterprise tools. So we'll talk about things like Tenable Stack. There's the Alien Vault Enterprise. I mean, we're talking about products that or Logic Gate or some of these they are big lift products, right? We talk about implementations of some of those. It's like, we're going to implement this over the next 12 to 18 months. It's like, what? The SMB space is like, we implement something like today, right? Yeah. Like, I'm going to install an iBoss appliance this afternoon, and I'm going to do it in probably about 1 to 2 hours, and I will be done. I implemented new firewalls. It took me roughly configuration prep. It took me about 15 hours to get it all done. And it's, like I said, it's relatively done. I wanted to come back to this, though, because I think one of the things that's concerning to me, having also worked with enterprise, is just because the enterprise can afford it, can hire the resources to deploy it, doesn't mean they're necessarily doing anything with it. I have witnessed firsthand going in and looking at the things that they go, oh, we've got to be NIST compliant, or we've got to be whatever it might be. And you go in and look, and you're like, I'll use Tenable as an example with the SC. I'm inside Tenable, and it's like, you can go to the reports section and go through the list and go, CMMC, check. CMMC level 2, check. NIST 171, check. And boom, you have a complete dashboard that shows you all of the areas that you are either satisfying or needing to remediate to satisfy those controls. And you're like, well, wait a second. You bought this tool. You're talking about it from purely a security standpoint, yet you actually have no idea where your real risk is, and you don't know what to do about it, because for them to tell you, the outsourced MSSP, hey, looks like from a security standpoint, we're doing pretty good this month. Are you? Because just because you're secure doesn't actually mean you're necessarily satisfying the controls. Right. So
you have to map it.
So I was curious, like, how often do you run into this? Like, you work with enterprise where you go into an environment, they've bought tools that they're using in-house. And I just kind of twitched out a little bit. They bought tools that they've got in-house. They bring you in, and you bring in the onshore stack. And based on your findings, you're now having a conversation with this client or prospective client that is totally conflicting with what they believe has been happening this whole time, because they've got all these great tools.
Well, remember, the main thing that onshore security does is the MDR service, our detection service.
Right.
And that's with our stack, and plenty about it, elk stack, developed SIM, and, our sensors, based on Suricata and other tools, whatever. But so it's our stack. Now, but the thing is that when we bring it in, it's a layer.
Right.
And so, if from one perspective, of course, it's detection, and that's what we say, whatever, but it's also an audit. And so 100% of the time, we're seeing things on the network that they didn't know were on the network, were not addressed in policy, that were not adequately described in controls, that don't show up the same way in their logs, that don't show up the same way in their scans, aren't correlated. I mean, I could go on and on.
So I set you up with that question. I really did.
I
set you up with that question because I wanted to hear you say what I think is true, that at the SMB level, they're not buying all those tools. There's no
SMB is not getting that layer of
but they also don't have
either,
Well, that's I'll go there in a second.
Maybe
the reality is the belief that you have something to make you secure is not as prevalent in the SMB space, because they don't have a budget to buy the products and tools that would give them some sense of warm fuzzy. We do a lot in the SMB space of doing risk assessments. The tools have evolved enough where a risk assessment, a vulnerability assessment, for the most part, can be something that's affordable in the SMB space. Remediation, that's a whole different conversation, because obviously that goes back to what are the costs to fix that hole. But the reason why I brought that up is what you said about enterprise is they have the money, they are spending the money to try and be secure, to improve their security posture. And to your point, when you come in and do that audit and you find all those holes, it's not because those tools aren't doing the job. It's because even at the enterprise level, they don't have the resources or the understanding to make decisions without bringing in somebody else to help them see it through the external lens. Inside out is easy. It's always good. It's always greener when I'm looking at it from the inside. And I often want to say, no, you're wrong, because you came from the outside looking in. It's like, well, you don't know what we have.
Right. No.
So I want to say that that's encouraging to the SMB space too, to go, look, the tools don't make you secure.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely the case. And let me add a component though that I think you're not touching on, and that is that there is a bias when we're coming from the infrastructure side. Still to this day, most enterprises kind of fit the security kind of under their infrastructure management, and there's a bias to see security as this kind of check or add-on, whatever, without having any kind of authority. And you think inherently there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but I can tell you the real outcomes out of that are negative. And I think there's the same bias in the SMB space. And so this is kind of like, no, we know what we have. You think you do till you actually check. You'll be surprised. Or no, that's okay to do until like somebody says, look, here are the outcomes. Here are the risks. Have they even talked to their financial people and to understand like what the actual impact of something would be?
Have you done a business impact analysis? Right. I mean, that's hard. MSPs generally steer clear of that because that's not as technical. One last point along those same lines. The SMB, generally speaking, doesn't have to go upstream to get buy-in. And that's one of the big pluses as an MSP going into an SMB space where you're like, this is what needs to happen. It's either they can get out the checkbook and write the check or not. It's not let me take this to the board and in 6 to 12 months, we'll make a decision about whether or not we need to put real firewalls in, right? So with that, any parting words, Stel? You're always the go-to for me when I have security questions, especially onshore in general. Yes, I might be biased because I used to work there and I still do kind of work there. I throw that out there. I want you to know that this is coming from a place of true respect and trust in knowing that I have resources who truly understand the security space without sugarcoating it. The answer is not going to be the one I want to hear. It's going to be the one that I need to hear. Stel, where can people find you and any parting words?
Well, so Stel at onshore.com and our website, onshore.com. Please, I know the audience here are MSPs in the SMB space. And I used to be in that space. As we moved more into security, we moved up market. And this is why we're not in the SMB space anymore. But I learned a lot of lessons there. And I do think it can be done better in the SMB space. I don't think it could be the same as enterprise, but it doesn't need the same thing as enterprise either. And I don't think the answers are there. And I don't think, everybody out there trying to buy out different products to create a full stack is really the right answer. So I think we need to backtrack. Please, MSPs, figure out what those clients really need, document what they need, get them to spend a little bit of money on policy, decide what framework they want to follow, have good, clear documentation, and make decisions based on those policies rather than on just, hey, what's the cool product or whatnot.
What's the next firewall upgrade?
Right. Yeah. Oh, and sure. Maybe there's lots of great firewalls, but does it satisfy the controls that you're trying to satisfy? That's the firewalls in some ways is the easiest one because that's flattened. I think crazy stuff's going on at the endpoint right now.
The EDR space.
Yeah. It's just, and great. There's better antivirus stuff, but is it actually loggable? A lot of them are not.
Right.
The stuff that's behavioral more is. Can I tune the output from those devices? I mean, there's things like that you won't even think to ask until you put a policy in place that says, I want to
do the
log my activity on my workstation.
Yeah. That's great.
So please start with that. It's really cheap. It's the biggest bang for the buck. I think it helps you upsell too. and upsell the right things.
Right. Because at the end of the day, you are the go-to consultant, right? The MSP is it should be the trusted advisor. And I know that's thrown out around a lot, and I want to be careful of using it appropriately. But the reality is the client is making decisions based on your recommendations. And we obviously can get into the whole today's Tuesday and we want you to spend more money, or our costs are going up, spend more money. Nobody wants to hear that. But when you can come in and say, hey, based on our analysis of your security posture and your risks, these are some things that we want you to consider. Making a decision this second isn't going to change that risk until it's implemented. So if you feel that you want to, noodle on that risk for a while, by all means, hopefully we can come to an understanding that says, if you don't do A through Z, you're at least tackling, B, K, and L, you're doing something to improve that. Awesome, Stel. I really appreciate it. And with that, this has been MSP 1337. Have a great week.
Thanks.